Welcome to episode 232 of the Pharmacist Voice podcast. I'm the host, Kim Newlove. My guest today is Dr. Frieda Wiley, and we're discussing her book, Telecommuting Psychosis From Surviving to Thriving While Working in Your Pajama Pants. This is part 12 of 15 in my Pharmacist Authors Summer Series. I hope you are having a great summer. If you find this in the future, I hope you're having a great season whenever you listen to this. If you're new to the Pharmacist Voice podcast, welcome. Again, I'm Kim Newlove, the host. I'm a pharmacist by training, but I'm not in clinical practice anymore. I am a voice actor and a podcast host. I graduated from the University of Toledo College of Pharmacy with my BS Pharm in 2001. Among other things, I narrate audiobooks for pharmacists. If you have a project in mind, whether it's an audiobook, a medical narration project, or something podcast related, contact me through my website, thepharmacistvoice.com. Let me tell you a little more about my guest, then we'll dive into the interview. Dr. Frieda Wiley is a pharmacist turned medical writer and journalist who has written for publications like O, the Oprah Magazine, WebMD, and U.S. News, in addition to corporations, universities, and the National Institutes of Health. A telecommuter for more than a decade, she has spent 8 years researching the effects of working from home on physical and mental health. In her Amazon best-selling book, Telecommuting Psychosis: From Surviving to Thriving While Working in Your Pajama Pants, she shares her findings and experiences. The book is available on Amazon, barnesandnoble.com, and other outlets. Without further ado, here's my interview with Dr. Frieda Wiley. Hi, Frieda. Welcome to the Pharmacist Voice podcast.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. I'm excited to have you here for the Pharmacist Authors Series. And you wrote a book. I want to hear all about your book. What's it called?
Okay, the book is called Telecommuting Psychosis, and the subtitle is From Surviving to Thriving While Working in Your Pajama Pants.
I love it. What are you wearing pajama pants right now? We're telecommuting, right?
I'm not going to stand up and model them for you, but yeah, I kind of am. I thought it was appropriate. You look the part.
That's right. That is a great subtitle because it really gives you a peek into what this book is about. But in your own words, why did you write it? I mean, what is it about?
Yeah, so the book is actually the culmination of an 8-year project. I became a telecommuter shortly after I started practicing. I was a hybrid worker when I was in community pharmacy. So, I was doing the medication therapy management. And because the pharmacy didn't really have, or the pharmacy chain didn't really have an office space for me to work, then it made sense for me to work from home 1 to 2 days a week for the administrative features. And then when I transitioned into managed care, I became fully remote accidentally, overnight, unexpectedly. I applied for a job that I thought was going to require me to move to Hoboken, New Jersey, right outside of New York City, and become licensed in New Jersey and potentially New York City as well. And then when they found out that I had remote experience, they pitched me the idea of working from home full time with the promise of traveling occasionally, like once a month or every other month, to be in the office and help with training, because they said they needed to hit the ground running. They were behind schedule with their numbers. And at the time, I was the only pharmacist with the MTM experience that they were seeking. So the irony is that, unfortunately, the company was acquired about 3 months after I was hired, so I slipped through the cracks. And I just started to notice I was feeling a little not so awesome anymore. I erroneously assumed that working from home full time would be a pretty seamless transition from what I had previously in the hybrid role, but that's not true. And so I talked to the few friends I had at the time who had worked from home at some point. And I also talked to other people, just reaching out, networking with people. And most of those people had gone back into the office setting for some of the reasons that I was experiencing challenges. And then all the literature I found, it didn't talk about remote work. It basically, well, remote work in the space of the mental aspect. It was focusing on productivity. And if they said anything at all about how it affects you mentally, it was mainly focusing on just going for a walk. It would be one sentence if they said that at all.
It sounds like you were inspired to write this book even before the pandemic. Is that right?
Yeah, so I went fully remote for the first time on April 18th of 2012. So I have been a full-time telecommuter since that time. And I saw it as an opportunity to fill the void. Originally, it was a journal because I was venting since nobody seemed to understand or at least relate to what I was experiencing. And then the pandemic gave me the impetus to finish it because all of a sudden now there's this deluge of studies on the mental aspects of working from home. Plus, people were actively having conversations about it because so many people were thrown into this setting during the pandemic in the same way that I was a decade before almost.
What kind of advice do you give in the book? Is it an advice book?
Yeah, so it's semi autobiographical, and then I do give advice. I talk about what worked for me as well as science backed evidence on what to do and how to manage. So, a couple of disclaimers here. Telecommuting psychosis is not an officially recognized clinical term in the DSM. In the book, I say that that's how I described what I was going through at my peak of mania. And unfortunately, at the time I was writing the book, spending all this time researching, there really wasn't a clinical term in the data. So I talk about that. And then I talk about how to manage mental health, the effects of working from home on mental health, and how there are data that show that if you work from home 2.5 days or more per week, you're going to experience higher levels of techno stress than people who work from home less. So that supports the things that I said. And I talk about the social aspect too, because it's just so important.
You mentioned something that a lot of pharmacists listening to this are going to grab onto. You said there is no DSM criteria for telecommuting psychosis.
Mhm.
Therefore, what is your definition of telecommuting psychosis?
So, my definition is feelings of depression, changes in mood, personality. I basically was extrapolating this term from postpartum psychosis, except I didn't have feelings of harming myself. But I did have, looking back on it, delusions because it was more than a year before I met my coworkers. So I started to invent things in my mind. What did they look like? What were their facial expressions like? So it can be delusions, depression, extreme feelings of isolation, apathy, and just the lack of social engagement, changes in personality.
Thank you for explaining that. When you first started telecommuting back in 2012, was Zoom a thing? Could you see your coworkers when you telecommuted?
No, so I flew to Hoboken for the for the interview, and then it was more than a year before I met my boss, my coworkers, or the admin staff in person. Um, Actually, my first video call came through on someone's cell phone because they wanted to know what I looked like. It was a small startup company, and they did not have the infrastructure in place to support that type of environment.
That is different. I mean, we're talking more than 10 years ago. So that is so different. How do you feel like it's different now, the telecommuting psychosis? You mentioned the imagining what coworkers look like thing. Now I think Zoom kind of changes that. But,
Yeah.
how is telecommuting different and what kind of features of the psychosis now appear, even though you can see people?
Yeah, well, there's still the starvation for human interaction I have found. So, for example, I took on a full-time consulting gig, or what turned into a near full-time commitment with an organization during 2020. And one of the higher ups always insisted everyone turn their cameras on, and people are silently grumbling behind the scenes. And come to find out, this woman with all of this experience and whose, you know, career trajectory I had admired, she was feeling lonely. So sometimes that the camera can help it, but people will still feel isolated, or depending on your personality type, especially if you're an extrovert, there's more of a feeling of that you're missing out there's still a lot of, I guess, pushback in terms of how a worker can thrive in this environment without the understanding that it depends on the nature of the work and the personality type. So I have found that more extroverts are still struggling with this as opposed to people who are introverts or ambiverts.
Okay, thanks for sharing that. It sounds like this book is part defining a problem, the telecommuting psychosis. It's part your journal entries explaining your experience with it, but then you've also got the data explaining that other people experience it. And then you're saying that you have some suggestions for how to deal with it as well, right?
Yeah, so I want to say that I don't claim to have all the answers. As I said before, I saw this book as a much needed reference point because it's filling a void of something that wasn't discussed. Mental health is still largely stigmatized when the reality is that mental health issues are very common when you have 20% of the population at any given point having some kind of mental health condition. And it's not necessarily something as severe or chronic as schizophrenia. So, yeah, I talk about what I did to dig myself out. Um, Part of it was becoming a digital nomad, which was something that I did prior to the pandemic. I slowed down on that during the pandemic for obvious reasons because of my own insecurities and lack of comfort and public safety concerns. But I also talk about how to manage when you're a caretaker or you are a parent. And so I interviewed, obviously not having children. I interviewed mothers and I included excerpts from a particular parent and what she did to manage. And I also share with people different resources and places to go for more information.
Resources are very helpful. I'm glad to hear you did that. Is that in the main text or is that more like an appendix in the back?
Yeah, so it's throughout, and I'm thinking of just depending on the type of feedback that I continue to get from people. So I just had my first book signing over the weekend. I might actually come up with a
Congrats.
handout. Thank you. I may create a handout for people. One of the resources I have at the end of the book, actually, in addition to the references, obviously, is I have a questionnaire, a telecommuting kind of screening questionnaire for people who are contemplating remote work. So, questions that they can ask the potential employers. Because looking back on my experiences and then also having talked to people and remaining plugged into the community, there are certain questions that I either didn't know to ask, didn't want to ask because I felt insecure, and it can help to shape or gather information so that way the employee can start to craft some sort of a process. A lot of it has to do with planning. A lot of it does planning, preparation, and education.
I'm trying to think of when somebody interviews for a job that's remote. I'm trying to
Mhm.
think of what do they look up? What kind of a list of questions do they typically have? And how can you include your resource that you're going to create, this worksheet, with their thought process? Any idea on that?
Now, I haven't thought about that aspect. I've thought about more or less working with organizations as an employee resource group partner, perhaps, to provide them with education around this. But I think that also there needs to be something more mainstream to help support people. We've made some major strides as far as having these conversations about why remote work is different because prior to 2020 oftentimes the majority of the comments on social media and in other environments about remote work focused on the negative and kind of dismissing it. Employees are not productive, they're not this or whatever, instead of looking at the other aspects. And oftentimes that comes from people who don't understand it. So, there again, the education and partnering with these organizations, it's really imperative to improve the environment for fully remote as well as hybrid workers.
I think you're onto something because employers who are hiring employees who will then work remote could do this as kind of like a looking out thing, a preventative measure for getting the most out of their potential employees by
Mhm.
screening them for this, possible telecommuting psychosis. It's a very interesting topic, something that I certainly did not have background on until we started talking about it. Thanks for bringing awareness to the topic.
Well, thank you. It was scary for me, I have to say, because of the stigma surrounding mental health. And for me to come out and say, "Hey, I lost my mind working from home," where I felt like it, that took a lot for me. But I ultimately decided to do it because I see an opportunity to help. And as I even said during my book talk over the weekend, if it helps one person, then it's worth it to me because I don't want someone to go through what I went through. I think that my experience was probably more extreme than many others for the reasons I mentioned. I didn't have this open network and display of information that is available now through social media and all the articles and things that have popped up about it now, thanks to the pandemic. It's just about helping others.
Well, I appreciate what you're doing. And it sounds like your audience is not just other telecommuters, but like we were saying, maybe HR individuals, people that are in human resources. Other than those two groups of people, the people that are possibly
Mhm,
experiencing
mhm.
telecommuting psychosis and the HR individuals, who else do you think your book is good for? Who's your audience?
Yeah, so the audience is also um, people who work in the mental health space. They tend to be researchers, psychologists, psychiatrists, and other stakeholders in that space. People who are working with also creatives and entrepreneurs because depending on the type of entrepreneur you are, like me having been an entrepreneur for more than a decade, we tend to work crazy hours. Work life balance is crazy. Anyone who has a sedentary job, so even if they're not a telecommuter, the truck drivers, you may not think about that, but some of the tips that I give are actually applicable to anyone who has a predominantly sedentary job. So that's also a space to tap into. And also, these organizations that are targeting career development, because it's not going away, even though there are articles saying that telecommuting is going to go away, and there's been a lot of controversy with the great return to work. Also, organizations that have dialed back on their resources to support telecommuters because we saw a deluge of that happening with the great return. So, okay, maybe they're dialing back for financial reasons or because there is a massive return to work, but there's a great likelihood there will be some employees who are still in a remote or hybrid setting, and those people still need support.
You bring up a great point, educating mental health practitioners, because if they're not really familiar with this, maybe there will be diagnostic criteria someday. You may be helping them out by just, coming out and explaining that you feel like you had telecommuting psychosis and that takes away the stigma, but then it also makes it more mainstream, more normal to talk about. You may be helping them.
I hope so. That was scary too, because the medical community can be a little harsh at times when it comes to
Judgmental.
yes. So that was my main concern. Originally,
Mhm.
I was not even going to put telecommuting psychosis in the title, even though that has been in my head for years. But I also felt that it would catch the attention of people who have a clinical background, even though the book is written in plain language.
Well, some people may look at that title and think it's kind of a play on words. Like, they may think that you are proposing that I am telecommuting and it's making me crazy. But really, you're actually saying that I'm telecommuting and it is bothering me and my mental health. So I think some
Yeah.
people will be curious about the title.
Okay. And I appreciate that. I've gotten a lot of feedback about the title over the years. And you never really know until it's out there. But regardless, like I said, the whole point was just to educate people and to create a platform so that people can start getting help. I don't want people to go through what I went through.
Oh, I appreciate that. Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for sharing the topic. And I know I'm going to put you on the spot here, but do you happen to have an excerpt from the book, a little sample that you'd like to read to my audience?
Sure. This is from chapter 3, 9 major myths about telecommuting. So I'll just read a little bit about a few myths. Myth number one, you work less than everyone else if you work at all. It always amazes me how many people think telecommuters spend their days twiddling their thumbs, glued to the television because they don't have to work. But the fact of the matter is, the opposite holds true. You may work harder as a telecommuter than you did when you held an office position. Apparently, the pandemic has only amplified this fact. According to a New York Times article published in June 2021, some bosses may expect their employees to work longer hours because they are at home. Anecdotally, I can report that some of my colleagues and friends who became first time teleworkers during the pandemic complained that their bosses were actually giving them more work because they were at home. Myth number two, you were living the life. I won't lie, once I started working from home just a day or two a week, I couldn't see myself going back into an office every single day. I immediately enjoyed the escape from the intense office bustle and the break from the hour-long one-way commute. However, part of my relief also came because a remote environment complements my personality. I'm a highly sensitive person, and the bustle of the in house positions often overwhelms me and leaves me exhausted. Myth number three, all telecommuting jobs allow you to set your schedule. I have experienced the extremes of both scheduling situations in my career, setting my own schedule and having every single minute of my workday predetermined for me. My first telecommuting job actually required me to set my own schedule because I needed to define the days I would fill prescriptions in pharmacies. I also needed to schedule appointments with physicians, patients, corporate managers, and potential business partners. My second job took out all the guesswork that comes with coordinating a schedule because the groundwork had already been established. The program was already in place, and other staff members handled the administrative duties, so we pharmacists could focus exclusively on our interactions with patients. In fact, everything was so scheduled that my entire workday consisted of back to back patient consultations and company meetings. Much like the stories you hear about community pharmacy, I also almost needed to schedule my restroom breaks. With that said, my experiences aren't the rules or the exceptions. These are just many variations in telecommuting. The role of the remote worker is to continues to evolve and remains as dynamic as today's workplace. Obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic has only added to that.
Thank you for sharing that excerpt. I appreciate the sample. My audience, I'm sure, will appreciate that too. To my audience, maybe now you know that this book is right for you. So thank you again, Frieda, for reading a sample. That was great.
Thank you.
All right. Now, where can my audience buy this book?
Sure. So the book is available on Amazon to make it easier. You can get it on the Barnes and Noble website, and you can request it at local bookstores if you want. It may be coming to some libraries near you. Who knows?
Yeah, who knows? I saw online that it's available as an ebook, right? A Kindle book, and also as a paperback.
That's correct. Yeah. I was actually in the process of recording the audiobook earlier this year that I had planned to have out by now, but life got in the way. So I will get to it eventually. I've been getting requests for it.
I love audiobooks. I am much more likely to listen to a book, or I guess I should say I'm much more likely to read a book with air quotes if it's an audiobook rather than the printed book because I'm just always on the move.
Yeah, and I'm actually finding the same holds true for me now. I recently, like as in the past 2 months, got into listening to audiobooks because being back in Texas, I spend a lot of time in my car now. So it's a great way to pass the time.
Yeah, you mentioned that you were a digital nomad for a while. Can you explain what that is for anybody who maybe didn't pick up on what that is?
Yeah, so a digital nomad is essentially a person who works from home, but they change the location of where they live. So they kind of move around just like a nomad. Some people take it across the globe, which I actually was about to do as COVID-19 was happening. So that's why I tabled it. But I just bounced around the country. I have been a seasonal resident in Ohio before when I was doing internships in pharmacy school. I moved, yep, Buckeye love, right?
OH.
so, yeah, I moved back to Ohio. I moved back to Arizona. I also would just, take up stints in different places that piqued my interest. So, yeah. I was in the process of wanting to move to Seattle when I was still working for the managed care firm in New Jersey. But unfortunately, that meant I would have to start my workday at 5 a.m. And yeah,
That doesn't sound as appealing, does it? Stay on the East Coast or in the central region.
yeah, I can deal with 1 hour, but five, yeah, pre pharmacy school, I had a job that started at 6 in the morning. So I have the t shirt. I'm good.
That's funny. Worked the job, got the t-shirt. All right, cool. Well, thanks for explaining where my audience can find your book, and thanks for explaining about the audiobook in progress that gives us all hope that we can buy that and listen to that soon. Have you started recording it in a studio? I mean, what is your experience with the audiobook like?
Yeah, so I was working with someone. I should have reached out to you now that am thinking about it. I was working with someone who's very experienced in this area and has a background in broadcast journalism as well. And so I was recording with software, but I really feel like I might need to get into a studio setting because I don't like some of the sound. And that was another thing that was causing reverb. I know there's a process to soundproofing and so forth, but even with recording television, radio, and podcasts that I've been doing with the book promo, it's been a challenge. Like something will sound great when I'm testing it, but then for some reason when I hear it, the playback, it's terrible.
Audio quality matters. You will not pass specifications if you don't have good audio quality. So, yeah, let's talk sometime about audiobooks. Happy to help.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Now that we know what the book's about, why you wrote it, who the audience is, where my audience can buy it, let me just ask a couple more questions. Why should your audience read this book?
You should read this book because whether you're new to telecommuting or whether you are just the consummate expert in telecommuting, there's still something you can learn from it. And if nothing else, it can be a resource to share with friends or other people who were in the experience and maybe having some challenges with it and may not know where to go. And maybe they feel like it's not okay to come forward or how to get help. And the other thing is that it's still great, in my opinion, as a resource just on how to be healthier. Because even if we are healthcare professionals, for example, we all fall into our own routines. And it's so much easier to treat and care for other people than it is ourselves. We need those reminders. An external resource is always a great help.
Absolutely. I think you kind of covered my last question. What do you want people to do with the information? We want them to be educated, but then use it as a resource. Do you have anything to
Yeah.
add to that?
Yeah, just first of all, to know that there's no shame in seeking help in the mental health space, and that instead of feeling anxious about it or that it's not okay to come forward, give yourself some credit and celebrate that. Because admitting that there's a problem is kind of like what they say about the 12-step program with alcoholism. Admitting there's a problem is the first step. Too often in the society and especially in different communities, we are afraid to come forward. We're afraid to say anything. And all that's doing, it's hurting ourselves and it's hurting others.
Thank you for sharing that. That's excellent advice. And also, one last thing here, and then I promise we'll wrap this up. What kind of transformation do you want from your readers? Maybe they're uneducated about the telecommuting psychosis. They need a resource. They're scared that they may have it. And then after they read the book and get educated, what do you think life will be like for them?
Hopefully, it'll be empowering because if nothing else, like I said, I don't claim to have all the answers. I'm still continuing to do research because new data is unfolding every day. And I'm still continuing to talk to people and collect even more information. I want people to feel empowered and I want them to have a can do. So, me sharing my story, it probably does read a little bit dark. That's true. But the latter half of the book is light because it's offering solutions. I'm telling what I did. And I also want them to walk away knowing that after reading this book, maybe telecommuting could be for me if I can establish a routine or a system that works for me, or process a wellness check in with myself and different things. Or it might inform them to know that, well, you know what, maybe it's not for me, or maybe I'd come out better as a hybrid worker, and that's okay. As I talk about in the book, I learned a lot more about myself as a telecommuter than I did working in an office environment.
All right. Thank you for sharing the light at the end of the tunnel. It's a book that is meant to help and provide some hope. There is a way to work from home and not get telecommuting psychosis, right?
Yes, absolutely.
All right. You heard it here first. Thank you, Frida. All right. Is there anything else you want to share as we wrap this up?
Well, if you're interested, you can follow me on social media. All my handles are the same, Dr. Frieda Wiley, something like that, at Instagram, Twitter, and whatnot. You can connect with me on LinkedIn, and also if you visit my website, I do have some children's books in the works. So stay tuned for that. It's a series about, thank you, a series about women who ran for president before Hillary Clinton, and it's this year it's featuring two Buckeyes. You'll be appreciative of that. So the first woman to run, the first Black
Yeah.
woman to run. So Victoria Woodhull and Shirley Mitchell, who passed away last year, and Patsy Mink, who is going to be featured in U.S. currency this year as the first Asian American woman to run and the first Congresswoman of color.
Very nice. I was giving her a thumbs up. So she was saying, like, yes. Thanks for asking. Yeah, I remember when we started setting this up, she's like, not only do I have this one book that's already been published, but I'm working on three more. And I am so glad you brought that up. And they're children's books. This book that we are talking about today is a book for adults, but you've got three in the works for children, which is awesome.
Yeah, that was my childhood dream. So to always write children's books. So I'm so grateful to have these opportunities. And I appreciate you again for allowing me on your podcast.
Well, thank you for being here on the Pharmacist Authors Series to share how you use your voice as an author. And I look forward to maybe having you back on next June because I'm planning to do this again. And I do like having repeat guests.
Well, thank you for that. It's been an honor. And it's good to meet you, see you, put a face with a voice.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I know we've been connected on LinkedIn for well over a year, and now this is our first meeting. It's really cool to meet people who I am only connected to online. So thanks again, Frida, for saying yes to this podcast interview. Great to meet you, and hopefully we'll see each other again next year.
Thank you.
All right, you take care. Bye, Frida.
Bye bye.
Thank you again to Dr. Frieda Wiley for being my guest on the Pharmacist Authors Series on the Pharmacist's Voice podcast. When I first heard the title of Frieda's book, Telecommuting Psychosis From Surviving to Thriving While Working in Your Pajama Pants, I wasn't sure what to expect. After this interview, however, I realized that telecommuting psychosis is a mental health issue, and I was unaware of it until right now. I appreciate Dr. Wiley being vulnerable and doing all that research and bringing awareness to the issue so that we can all now use her book as a resource. Thank you, Dr. Wiley. Thank you for listening to episode 232 of the Pharmacist's Voice podcast. Please visit thepharmacistvoice.com to read the show notes. In the show notes, you'll find a link to the book Telecommuting Psychosis From Surviving to Thriving While Working in Your Pajama Pants by Dr. Frieda Wiley. You'll also find her social media links, her website, and more. Please share this episode with others, especially telecommuters. And if you like this podcast, please subscribe to or follow the Pharmacist's Voice podcast on your favorite podcast player and YouTube to get each new episode right when it comes out. I'll be back on Friday, July 21st with my interview with Dr. Tim Ulbrich. We'll be talking about his book, Seven Figure Pharmacist: How to Maximize Your Income, Eliminate Debt, and Create Wealth. Thanks for listening today. I'll talk to you on Friday.